Near Port Huron, Michigan, in the freezing waters of Lake Huron, a salvage crew spotted something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A massive steel ship floated upside down in the water, its hull completely encased in ice. The vessel was silent, drifting like a tomb. No distress signals, no survivors clinging to the wreckage, just an inverted steel mountain of ice slowly rotating in the current. For days, no one could identify it. The name was underwater, frozen beneath the surface. They didn't know which ship it was, which crew had died, or how many men were trapped inside that frozen steel coffin. This was the mystery ship of 1913, and it became the symbol of the deadliest storm in Great Lakes history. When sailors think about death at sea, they imagine drowning. They imagine the cold water rushing into their lungs, the desperate swim toward a surface they'll never reach. But on November 9th, 1913, the water didn't get the chance to kill them. The air did it first. The temperature dropped so fast, and the wind-driven spray was so relentless that the Great Lakes encased entire ships in ice before they could even sink. Sailors didn't drown. They froze solid, standing at their posts, encased in layers of ice that grew thicker with every wave that crashed over the deck. This is the story of the White Hurricane, the storm that turned water into a weapon and air into a killer. In just 16 hours, the Great Lakes witnessed a meteorological event so catastrophic that it rewrote the history of shipping in North America. 12 major ships vanished with all hands. 250 sailors died, not just sunk, but erased. Ships that left port on a calm autumn morning were gone by nightfall, swallowed by what witnesses called a white hurricane that came out of nowhere and killed with the precision of an executioner. This isn't just a story about bad weather. It's about the physics of a meteorological bomb, the mystery of a ship that floated upside down for days while the nation watched in horror, and the terrifying true account of a crew that had to burn their own ship's furniture in a bathtub just to keep from freezing to death while waves tore their vessel apart around them. The Ojibwe people who lived along the shores of the Great Lakes had a name for November. They called it Gashkadino Giizis, the freezing moon. It was the month when the gales of November arrived, when the water could turn solid, when the spirits of the lakes demanded respect. Indigenous fishermen knew to pull their nets by the first week of November. They knew that the lakes, which seemed so calm and predictable in summer, became predators in the late fall. The warm water held its heat while the air above turned Arctic, creating conditions that could spawn storms of unimaginable violence. But the industrial captains of the early 20th century didn't listen to indigenous warnings. They had steel ships now, massive ore carriers and grain haulers that dwarfed anything that had sailed before. They had schedules to keep, cargo to deliver, and bonuses to earn. November was the last month of the shipping season, the final chance to squeeze one more profitable run before the lakes froze solid for winter. So they pushed their luck. They sailed into conditions that their grandfathers would have called suicidal. One man didn't push his luck. Milton Smith was a sailor on the freighter Charles S. Price. He'd been sailing the lakes for years, and he knew the signs. On November 7th, 1913, when the Price was docked in Cleveland loading coal, Smith noticed something that made his skin crawl. The barometer was dropping fast, faster than he'd ever seen. The air had an electric quality to it, a tension that made his teeth ache. He couldn't explain it rationally, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to get off that ship. So he did. He walked off the Charles S. Price in Cleveland, abandoning his post, forfeiting his pay, and probably earning himself a reputation as a coward among the other sailors. They laughed at him, called him superstitious. The weather was mild, almost balmy for early November. The lake was calm. What was he afraid of? Milton Smith was the only man from the Charles S. Price to survive the next 72 hours. Every single one of his crewmates died. To understand what killed them, You have to understand what was happening in the atmosphere above the Great Lakes on November 7th and 8th, 1913. This wasn't just a storm. It was a meteorological anomaly, a perfect convergence of weather systems that created conditions so extreme they seemed impossible. Two massive weather systems were on a collision course. From the south, a warm, moisture-laden system pushed up from the Gulf of Mexico, carrying tropical air and heavy humidity. From the north, an Arctic blast screamed down from Canada, bringing sub-zero temperatures and bone-dry air. Normally, these systems would pass each other, creating normal autumn weather. But in November 1913, they met directly over the Great Lakes. The result was what meteorologists now call a cyclonic bomb, an explosive deepening of atmospheric pressure that creates hurricane-force winds in a matter of hours. The warm lake water, which had stored heat all summer long, acted like fuel for the developing storm. The temperature differential between the water and the air created a thermal engine of terrifying power. On the morning of November 8th, sailors woke up to mild weather. It was about 60 degrees, unseasonably warm. The sky was overcast but not threatening. Ships left port on schedule, their captains confident they could make the cross-lake run before any weather moved in. By nightfall, it was a whiteout blizzard with hurricane-force winds. The speed of the change was what made it so deadly. There was no gradual buildup, no time to seek shelter. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 6 hours. The wind went from 10 miles per hour to 70 miles per hour in the same time frame. Sailors who had been working in shirt sleeves at noon were fighting for their lives in Arctic conditions by dinner, but the temperature drop alone wouldn't have been catastrophic. Ships could handle cold weather. What they couldn't handle was what happened when 40-degree lake water met 0-degree steel in 80-mile-per-hour winds. It froze on contact. This phenomenon is called ice accretion, and it's one of the most dangerous conditions a ship can face. When spray hits a cold surface in high winds, it doesn't have time to run off. It flash freezes instantly, creating a layer of ice. In normal conditions, this might add a few inches of ice to the railings and deck, which the crew could chip away. But in the conditions of November 9th, 1913, the ice didn't stop accumulating. Wave after wave crashed over the ships, and each wave added another layer of ice. Within hours, ships were carrying hundreds of tons of extra weight, all of it on the upper surfaces. This is when the physics of buoyancy become a death sentence. Ships are designed with a specific center of gravity. The heavy cargo sits low in the hull. The lighter superstructure sits on top. This balance keeps the ship stable. But when you add hundreds of tons of ice to the deck, the masts, the railings, and the cabin structures, you raise the center of gravity. The ship becomes top-heavy. It doesn't need to take on water to sink. It simply becomes unstable, and then it rolls over. The capsizing doesn't happen slowly. It happens in seconds. The ship hits a wave at the wrong angle. The top-heavy structure shifts, and the entire vessel flips like a toy in a bathtub. There's no time to launch lifeboats, no time to send a distress signal. One moment you're sailing through a blizzard, and the next moment you're underwater, trapped inside a steel coffin that's rapidly filling with freezing water. This is almost certainly what happened to the Charles S. Price. But the ice didn't just make ships unstable, it also made them blind. Imagine being the captain of a Great Lakes freighter in the middle of the white hurricane. You're standing in the pilot house trying to navigate through waves that tower 3 stories high, but you can't see them. The windows of the pilot house are completely coated with opaque ice, layers and layers of frozen spray that turn the glass into a white wall. You can't see the bow of your own ship, let alone the waves ahead. You're sailing at full steam, because if you slow down, you'll lose steerage, and the waves will push you broadside, which means instant death. So you're flying blind through a maelstrom, trusting that the next wave won't be the one that flips you over. Some captains tried to send crewmen out onto the deck to chip away the ice from the pilot house windows. Those men were swept overboard within seconds, vanishing into the white chaos before they could even scream. The mystery ship floated upside down for 4 days. Salvage crews, rescue ships, and curious onlookers watched it drift near Port Huron. This massive steel hull, completely encased in ice, rotating slowly in the current. They tried to get close enough to identify it, but the ice made it impossible to read any markings. They shouted, hoping that someone might be alive inside, trapped in an air pocket. But there was only silence. The hull floated because it was full of air. When the Charles S. Price capsized, it happened so fast that the ship didn't have time to fill with water. The cargo holds and crew quarters became a sealed bubble, an underwater tomb that was buoyant enough to keep the inverted ship on the surface. The crew was almost certainly inside, drowned in the first few seconds of the capsize, their bodies floating against the ceiling of what had been their bunks. Eventually, the ice melted enough for divers to get close. They identified the ship by the name on the stern, which was now barely visible below the waterline. It was the Charles S. Price, the ship that Milton Smith had abandoned in Cleveland, the ship that had sailed into the storm with a full crew and never sent a distress signal. They never recovered all the bodies. In the days after the storm, the shores of Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and Lake Superior became graveyards. Bodies washed up on beaches from Michigan to Ontario, dozens of them, frozen solid. They were wearing life belts, which meant they'd had time to realize they were going to die. They'd managed to strap on the flotation devices before the ship went down, but the life belts couldn't save them from the cold. The bodies weren't just cold, they were encased in blocks of ice. Rescue teams and townspeople who came down to the beaches found corpses that looked like sculptures, men frozen in the moment of their death, arms outstretched, mouths open in silent screams. The ice had formed around them as they died, preserving them in grotesque detail. The teams had to use pickaxes and saws to break the ice just to move the bodies, just to search for identification. Imagine being the person who had to do that. Imagine swinging a pickaxe into the ice surrounding a frozen sailor, trying to be careful not to damage the body, knowing that this person had a family somewhere who was waiting for news. Not every ship sank. Some survived. But survival came with its own horror. The LC. Waldo was a steel-hulled freighter that got caught in the storm while crossing Lake Superior. The captain tried to make for Manitou Island, hoping to find shelter in the lee of the land. But the wind was too strong, and the waves were too high. The ship smashed onto the rocky shore of the island, driven onto the rocks by waves that were 40 feet tall. The impact shattered the rudder and ripped the propeller off the shaft. The engine stopped. The lights went out, and then the ship began to freeze. The crew of the LC Waldo found themselves trapped on a grounded ship in the middle of a blizzard, with no power, no heat, and waves that were still crashing over the deck every few seconds. The temperature was below zero. The wind was still howling at hurricane force. They couldn't stay on deck because the spray would freeze them solid within minutes. But they couldn't stay in the cabins because there was no heat. They had to make their own. The crew retreated to the forward cabin, the most sheltered part of the ship. They ripped up the wooden furniture, anything that would burn, chairs, tables, bunk frames, paneling from the walls. They found a cast-iron bathtub in the officers' quarters, dragged it into the cabin, and turned it into a makeshift stove. They fed the fire constantly, burning everything they could find, while the steel walls of the cabin groaned and shrieked with every wave impact. They huddled around that bathtub for 90 hours, 3.5 days, 72 hours of continuous waves, continuous wind, continuous cold. They took turns feeding the fire, rationing the wood, because if the fire went out, they would die. They couldn't sleep for long, because the cold would kill them if they stopped moving. They couldn't go outside because the deck was a skating rink of ice and spray. All they could do was sit in that steel room, burning their ship piece by piece, and pray that someone would come for them. When the rescue ship finally arrived, the crew almost didn't recognize the LC Waldo as a ship. It looked like an iceberg that had somehow gotten wedged onto the rocks. The entire superstructure was buried under a shell of ice several feet thick. The masts were encased in ice columns as thick as tree trunks. The railings had disappeared under frozen cascades that looked like waterfalls stopped in time. The rescuers had to use axes and saws to cut through the ice just to reach the cabin door. When they finally broke through, they found the crew still huddled around the bathtub fire, half delirious from exhaustion and hypothermia, but alive. The Waldo crew were the lucky ones. The James Carruthers was the newest, largest, most modern ship on the Great Lakes in 1913. It was on its maiden voyage, a point of pride for Canadian shipbuilding. The ship was 550 feet long, steel-hulled, equipped with the latest navigation equipment. It was carrying a full load of wheat from Fort William to Georgian Bay. It left port on November 8th, just as the storm was beginning to build. The James Carruthers vanished completely. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors. For days, search crews found nothing. Then debris began washing ashore near Goderich, Ontario. Pieces of the wheelhouse, life preservers, a section of the name board. But the ship itself was gone, swallowed by the lake somewhere in the middle of the storm. It wasn't until the following year that divers found the Carruthers. It was sitting upright on the bottom of Lake Huron, its hull crushed inward like an eggshell. Something had hit it with such force that the steel plates had crumpled. The prevailing theory is that a rogue wave, one of the massive walls of water that the storm was generating, caught the ship broadside and simply broke it in half. The ship would have sunk in seconds, taking all hands with it. The Argus and the Hydrus were sister ships, identical ore carriers owned by the same company. They left port hours apart on November 8th, both heading for the same destination. The Argus was first. The Hydrus followed. A captain of a passing ship saw the end of the Argus. He was fighting his own battle with the storm, trying to keep his ship headed into the waves, when he saw the Argus through a gap in the snow. The ship was caught in a trough between two waves, and the captain watched as the walls of water on either side seemed to converge. The Argus crumpled like an eggshell. The hull folded inward, the steel shrieking loud enough to hear over the wind. And then it was gone, pulled under in seconds. The Hydrus vanished without a witness. Somewhere in the whiteout, it met the same fate. 28 men on the Argus, 25 on the Hydrus. None survived. Sunday, November 9th, was the worst day. Meteorologists who analyzed the data afterward called it Holy Sunday, with bitter irony. It was the day when the storm reached its peak intensity, when every ship on the Great Lakes was fighting for survival, and when the majority of the deaths occurred. The wind on November 9th sustained at 70 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 90. To put that in perspective, a Category 1 hurricane has winds of 74 miles per hour. This was hurricane force wind, but instead of warm tropical air and rain, it was Arctic air and snow. The snow was falling so hard that visibility was measured in feet, not miles. Sailors couldn't see the bow of their own ships. They couldn't see the waves until they were already crashing over the deck, and they couldn't hear each other over the sound of the storm. Survivors who lived through the white hurricane all described the sound. It wasn't like normal wind. It was a shriek, a howl, a continuous scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The wind tore through the ice-coated rigging and made it sing like a saw blade. The steel hull groaned under the stress of the waves, a deep bass note that you felt in your bones more than heard. And underneath it all was the roar of the water, the endless crash of waves that sounded like artillery fire. The radio operators on the ships tried to send distress signals, but the storm was so violent that the antennas were ripped away. One by one, the ships went silent. The shore stations listened as ship after ship transmitted a final message, usually just a position and a plea for help, and then disappeared from the air. By midnight, on November 9th, the airwaves were silent. Every ship was either sunk, grounded, or running silent to conserve power. The storm broke on Monday, November 10th. The wind dropped. The snow stopped. The sun came out. And then the survivors saw what the storm had done. The coastline was littered with wreckage. Entire ships lay on their sides on beaches, their hulls torn open. Pieces of cabins, lifeboats, cargo, and bodies were scattered along hundreds of miles of shoreline. The water was full of debris fields, floating timber, barrels, life preservers, and the occasional body still frozen in its lifebelt. 19 ships were destroyed, 20 more were grounded or severely damaged, and 250 sailors were dead. The towns along the lakeshore mobilized. Rescue crews, volunteers, and curiosity seekers flooded the beaches, searching for survivors and recovering bodies. What they found was a scene of carnage that shocked even the most hardened sailors. Ships that had been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were now scrap metal. Cargoes that represented entire fortunes were scattered and ruined. And the bodies kept washing ashore, day after day, as the lake gave up its dead. But not everyone who came to the beaches came to help. There's a dark chapter in the aftermath of the White Hurricane that doesn't make it into most history books. Looters came down to the shoreline, not to recover bodies or assist survivors, but to rob the dead. Frozen corpses were stripped of wallets, watches, rings, anything of value. Cargo that washed ashore, tools, equipment, personal belongings, was stolen. Some people broke into the cabins of grounded ships and made off with anything they could carry. The authorities tried to stop it, posting guards on the beaches and arresting looters when they could catch them. But the coastline was too long, and there were too many isolated stretches where thieves could work undisturbed. It added a layer of human cruelty to the natural horror, a reminder that disasters don't just bring out the best in people. Why didn't anyone see this storm coming? Why did so many ships sail directly into a meteorological bomb that would kill them within hours? The answer is that they couldn't have known. Meteorological science in 1913 was primitive by modern standards. Weather forecasting relied on a network of observation stations that reported conditions via telegraph. A weather map might take hours to compile, and by the time it reached a ship captain, the information was already outdated. There were no weather satellites, no radar, no computer models. Forecasters couldn't see the storm developing until it was already happening. The warning system for ships consisted of flags flown at harbor stations. A red flag with a black square meant a storm was coming, but the flags were only as good as the information they were based on, and the information on November 8th was incomplete. Some stations raised storm warnings, others didn't. And even the stations that did raise warnings had no way of communicating the severity of what was coming. A storm could mean anything from rough seas to a minor gale. There was no terminology for cyclonic bomb or meteorological anomaly. Captains made their decisions based on experience and intuition, and both of those failed them in November 1913. The sailors who died in the White Hurricane weren't stupid or reckless. They were professionals doing a job they'd done 100 times before. They trusted their ships, their crews, and their knowledge of the lakes. But they were facing something that had never happened before, a perfect storm that combined elements in a way that was impossible to predict and almost impossible to survive. The White Hurricane changed Great Lakes shipping forever. In the aftermath, shipping companies and government agencies implemented sweeping reforms. Weather reporting became a priority, with more stations, better communication, and standardized warning systems. Ship design changed to account for the danger of ice accretion, with more attention paid to stability and center of gravity. Training requirements for captains and crews were strengthened. But the central lesson of the storm remained: ice is heavier than water, and wind is faster than steel. No matter how advanced the ship, no matter how experienced the crew, the lakes could still kill you if you didn't respect them. The indigenous fishermen had known this all along. The gales of November were not a surprise to them. They were a known hazard, a seasonal danger that demanded caution. But the industrial shipping industry of the early 20th century had convinced itself that technology had solved the problem of nature. Steel ships couldn't be sunk by a little wind and cold. Schedules couldn't be interrupted by superstition and old wives' tales. The White Hurricane proved them catastrophically wrong. Today, the Charles S. Price still lies on the bottom of Lake Huron, about 10 miles north of Port Huron. It rests upside down, a massive steel hull overturned on the lake bed. It is a popular dive site, but a somber one. Divers descend through the cold water to see the hull that once baffled the nation, the mystery ship that refused to reveal its name. The wreck is a monument to the day when the atmosphere turned against the sailors and the water turned to stone. It's a reminder that nature doesn't care about schedules, profits, or human arrogance. It's a memorial to 250 men who went to work one November morning and never came home. The Ojibwe were right about the freezing moon. It was the time when the lakes demanded respect, when the gales of November could turn the water solid and kill without mercy. The industrial captains learned that lesson too late, and they paid for it with the lives of their crews. The lake remembers. Every November, when the temperature drops and the first cold winds blow across the water, the lake remembers the White Hurricane. It remembers the ships that vanished, the sailors who froze at their posts, and the mystery ship that floated upside down like a steel tombstone. The Great Lakes are not oceans, but they can kill like oceans. They're freshwater seas with depths that reach hundreds of feet, with fetch distances long enough to generate massive waves, and with weather patterns that can turn deadly in hours. Sailors who work the lakes develop a healthy respect for them, a caution that borders on superstition. They watch the barometer, they listen to the forecasts, and they remember the stories of November 1913, when the lakes killed 250 men in a single day. Milton Smith lived the rest of his life knowing that his instinct had saved him. He never apologized for abandoning the Charles S. Price in Cleveland. He never felt guilty about walking away when his shipmates sailed to their deaths. He'd felt something that day, something he couldn't explain, and he listened to it. That instinct, that premonition, was the only reason he survived to tell the story. How many other sailors had the same feeling? How many of them ignored it because they didn't want to seem cowardly or superstitious? How many of them are now lying at the bottom of the lakes, frozen in time because they talked themselves out of their own survival instinct? The White Hurricane killed with efficiency. It didn't discriminate between experienced captains and new sailors, between modern ships and old ones, between lucky and unlucky. It simply killed anyone who was on the lakes when the two weather systems collided. There was no outrunning it, no hiding from it. The storm covered the entire length of the Great Lakes, from Superior to Ontario. Every ship on the water was in danger, and dozens of them didn't make it. The crews of the L.C. Waldo, huddled around their bathtub fire for 90 hours, survived because they did everything right. They stayed together, they rationed their fuel. They kept the fire burning. They didn't panic. They didn't try to abandon ship into a blizzard that would have killed them in minutes. They made themselves as small a target as possible and waited for the storm to pass. Other crews weren't so lucky, or so disciplined. Some tried to launch lifeboats in the middle of the storm and were swept away immediately. Some tried to stay on deck to chip away ice and were washed overboard. Some abandoned ship too early and froze in the water. Some stayed with their ships too long and went down with them. There was no right answer, no guaranteed path to survival. It was chaos, pure and simple. The storm was bigger than any human response, more powerful than any decision a captain could make. Survival came down to luck, location, and the specific combination of factors that determined whether your ship could withstand the wind, the waves, and the ice. The James Carruthers, the newest and best ship on the lakes, sank on its maiden voyage, the L.C. Waldo, an older vessel that should have been more vulnerable, survived. There was no pattern, no logic. The storm took what it wanted and left the rest. In the years after the White Hurricane, survivors struggled to describe what they'd experienced. The usual vocabulary of storms, rough seas, high winds, heavy snow, seemed inadequate. They talked about waves that were taller than buildings. They talked about wind that felt solid, like a physical force pushing against you. They talked about cold that hurt your bones, that made your teeth ache, that turned your breath to ice in your lungs. And they talked about the sound, always the sound, the shriek of the wind through the frozen rigging, the roar of the waves, the groan of the steel hull under stress, the silence when another ship disappeared from the radio, the absence of human voices in a white void where you couldn't see your own hands in front of your face. The psychological trauma of surviving the White Hurricane stayed with sailors for the rest of their lives. Many of them never went back on the lakes. Some developed phobias about November, about storms, about ice. Some had nightmares for decades, reliving the moment when a wave almost flipped their ship, or when they watched another vessel capsize and sink, or when they realized they were probably going to die. The families of the men who died had their own trauma. For many of them, there was no body to bury, no grave to visit. Their husbands, sons, and fathers simply vanished into the lake, swallowed by a storm that left no trace. The uncertainty was agonizing. Was he dead, or was he alive somewhere, injured and waiting for rescue? Did he die quickly, or did he suffer? Was his body at the bottom of the lake, or was it still trapped inside a sunken ship? Some families got answers when bodies washed ashore and were identified, but many others never knew. The lake kept their secrets. The economic impact of the White Hurricane was staggering. The ships that sank represented millions of dollars in capital, a devastating loss for the shipping companies that owned them. The cargoes, iron ore, coal, grain, were worth additional millions. The insurance industry took a massive hit, with claims that totaled more than the industry had ever paid out in a single event. Some smaller shipping companies went bankrupt. Others consolidated, bought out by larger competitors, but the human cost was incalculable. 250 men dead, hundreds of women widowed, hundreds of children left fatherless. Communities along the lakes lost entire cohorts of their working-age men. The economic ripple effects, lost wages, lost breadwinners, families plunged into poverty, affected thousands of people who never set foot on a ship. And yet, within a week, the shipping season resumed. New crews were hired. Repaired ships went back on the water. The industry couldn't afford to stop, even in the face of catastrophe. The demand for iron ore, coal, and grain didn't pause for morning. The ships had to sail, but they sailed differently. Captains were more cautious. Crews paid closer attention to weather reports. Ships stayed in port when the barometer dropped, even if it meant missing a bonus. The industry had learned its lesson, paid for in blood and steel. The meteorologists who studied the White Hurricane afterward were stunned by the data. The storm had deepened from a normal low-pressure system to a meteorological bomb in less than 12 hours, a rate of intensification that was almost unprecedented. The wind speeds, the temperature drop, the duration of the peak intensity, all of it was at the extreme end of what was theoretically possible. Some meteorologists argued that the storm was a once-in-a-century event, a freak occurrence that was unlikely to ever happen again. Others warned that climate patterns were changing, that the conditions that created the White Hurricane could recur. They were right. Major storms continued to hit the Great Lakes in subsequent decades, though none matched the death toll of 1913. The White Hurricane also sparked a national conversation about weather forecasting and public safety. If a storm this deadly could develop with so little warning, what other disasters were lurking undetected? The federal government invested in expanding the Weather Bureau, adding more observation stations and improving communication networks. The technology was still primitive, but the infrastructure improved. It would take decades before satellite imagery, radar, and computer modeling made weather forecasting reliable enough to prevent disasters like the White Hurricane. By then, the sailors of 1913 were long dead, and the ships they'd sailed were rusting at the bottom of the lakes. The legacy of the White Hurricane lives on in the culture of Great Lakes shipping. Every sailor who works the lakes knows the story. Every captain keeps an eye on the calendar as November approaches. The phrase "gales of November" has become shorthand for danger, a reminder that the lakes can turn deadly with little warning. Gordon Lightfoot immortalized this fear in his song "The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald," which tells the story of a ship that sank in a November storm in 1975. The refrain, "The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead," echoes the experience of the White Hurricane, when so many sailors vanished without a trace. The lakes don't give up their dead easily. The cold water preserves bodies, but it also hides them. Ships that sink in deep water can sit undisturbed for centuries. The Charles S. Price rests in relatively accessible water, but many of the ships that sank in 1913 are in depths too great for recreational diving. They're down there, somewhere in the darkness, entombing the sailors who died when the ice grew too heavy and the ship rolled over. Modern ship design has addressed many of the vulnerabilities that the White Hurricane exposed. Ships now have heated decks to prevent ice accumulation. They have anti-icing systems for windows and equipment. They have ballast systems that can compensate for top-heavy loading. But ice is still a threat, and storms can still kill. In 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in a November storm that meteorologists saw coming days in advance. The ship had all the modern safety equipment, including radar, radio, and advanced hull design, and yet it went down in minutes, taking all 29 crew members with it. The exact cause is still debated, but the prevailing theory is that the ship was swamped by massive waves, possibly exacerbated by ice accumulation. The lakes are not safe, and they never will be. They're too big, too deep, and too prone to violent weather. Respect is the only defense, and even that doesn't guarantee survival. The Charles S. Price, the mystery ship that floated upside down for 4 days, became the most famous symbol of the White Hurricane. Newspapers across the country ran stories about it, speculating about what had happened, debating whether anyone could still be alive inside. When divers finally identified it, the nation mourned. The image of that inverted steel hull, slowly rotating in the icy water, haunted the public imagination. It still does. Divers who descend to the wreck of the Charles S. Price swim along an overturned hull, a steel monument to catastrophe. They see the ship as it came to rest, upside down, exactly as it floated on the surface before it finally sank. They swim through the cargo holds where coal was once stored, past the crew quarters where men slept, exploring a vessel that has become a permanent grave. Some divers report feeling uneasy on the wreck, as if they're being watched. Others describe a profound sadness, a weight that settles on them as they swim through the remains of a disaster. It's easy to dismiss these feelings as psychological projection, the mind imposing meaning on an empty steel shell. But the feeling persists, even among experienced divers who've seen dozens of wrecks. Maybe it's the knowledge of what happened there. Maybe it's the sheer scale of the tragedy. Or maybe the lake really does remember. And the wreck of the Charles S. Price is more than just rusted metal at the bottom of Lake Huron. The freezing moon still comes every year. November still brings cold winds and rough seas to the Great Lakes. Sailors still watch the horizon with wary eyes as the month approaches. And every year, someone remembers the White Hurricane, the storm that killed 250 men and changed the lakes forever. The lake remembers. The sailors remember. And now you remember too.